X-Men know brutality, whether through the emotional loss of a team member, the decimation of millions, or just the gruesome brutality of a fight. Mutants truly have experienced it all. The end of the Hellion series has to be one of the most brutal things I've ever read. It was actually painful for me to read. My heart seriously hurt after finishing that series, and I was in tears for honestly most of the last issue. To watch this team of lovable but extremely weird misfits come together over multiple issues throughout this series, only to see many of them slip and self-destruct, was honestly something else. They had found a sense of family, only to lose that newfound family, and with it, for many of them, honestly their sense of hope. It was a brutal ending to what was otherwise honestly an uplifting story. I still can't believe that's how it ended, honestly. Zeb Wells out here just playing with my emotions, playing with my heart. I think the worst character for me in terms of how the story ended for them was honestly Wildchild, who basically decided to just accept that he didn't really belong anywhere and submitted to being in a medicated stupor. It really was tragic. What stories have moved you emotionally? For me, Wildchild's and the Hellions ending overall just literally brought me to tears. I actually struggled to read the pages. That's how much I was crying at the end of this series. It was really heartbreaking and really brutal. This is a traumatic one, or at least it probably was a traumatic one for Wolverine at least. Yep, we're talking about that moment. The moment when Wolverine was permanently separated from his adamantium. What are we talking about here? Divorce, babe. Divorce. Wolverine was divorced basically here from his adamantium, something that initially in the comics was suggested to be part of his mutant power. However, over time, of course, we'd come to learn that the adamantium-coated skeleton that he had, his claws, was not necessarily inherent, but was instead put in place by Weapon X. He did have claws, but they were just bone claws, and then Weapon X basically modified him and coated his whole skeleton in adamantium. When the X-Men faced off against Magneto in space, Magneto used his magnetic mutant powers to manipulate this metallic substance, this adamantium, fully removing it from Wolverine's skeleton. He'd get it back, but the extremely gruesome and painful de-adamantium process would leave its mark, making Wolverine more animalistic soon afterwards. Professor X has a lot of brutal moments in the comics. Honestly, he is tied to many of them because he has done some morally questionable things throughout his comic book history. One of these moments, however, might seem small in comparison to some larger missteps that he's had, but it still shocks me to this day, and I find it honestly quite brutal in a different way, so I'm gonna include it here. We're talking about Professor X admitting his feelings for Jean Grey. This wasn't something that Professor X shared aloud, but just seeing it confessed to, even in a thought bubble, was honestly enough for me. Now granted, at the time, I doubt this would have been as shocking when this comic was released, because it was issue number 3 of X-Men, considering that canon had not yet established that Jean was actually one of the Professor's really first X-Men, who he'd helped when she was only a little kid and he was a young adult. But given the context I had when I read this, yeah, it's a mess. One of the most brutal fights I've seen in a while is the one where Storm faces off against Tarn. Tarn the Uncaring is one of the mutants from Morocco, and he happens to be one of the most upsetting to face. Honestly, because of his mutant powers. Also, he's a mutant of Morocco, so they tend to be made of just tougher stuff in general. But really what makes his fights in general brutal are, honestly, his powers. Tarn can basically alter folks' genetic makeup, which is exactly what he does to take Storm's powers away after challenging her to a fight, or rather, after insulting her authority as Regent of Morocco, which she interprets basically as a challenge. And honestly, rightfully so. She responds in kind by saying she will see him in the circle for the two of them to duke it out between them for who should sit as regent, or rather, maybe just who should respect who. Now, when they do, Tarn uses his powers to take away Storm's powers and disfigure her, but still she manages to best him by stabbing him in the chest and threatening to end his life by puncturing his heart. Yeah, Storm, even when she doesn't have powers, she's a really amazing fighter, so you should not mess with her. She forces him to yield, and in the end he learns just how strong-willed Storm is and ultimately returns her powers to her, admitting she is of Morocco and perhaps she might even be of a Ment. That's how intense she is. I was not expecting this next one, which is quite a twist, or rather I wouldn't have been expecting it if I hadn't read it later. 2023 for me was a year of mainly focusing on indie comics in terms of my collection, seeing if I could make it a whole year without really collecting mainly superhero comics from the big two myself, instead focusing on collecting books from smaller or still large but honestly alternative publishers. Dynamite, Image, IDW, and even still some really indie self-published stuff. For the most part, I succeeded in last year's New Year's resolution. yay, in regards to this, but the downside was I ended up being more behind on my big two superhero stuff, like X-Men. As such, I already kind of knew the events of the Hellfire Gala before I actually read that Hellfire Gala. Even knowing it though, it was still shocking to behold Nimrod flying in and pretty much insta-killing, for the most part, the newly announced X-Men team. Honestly, poor Dazzler. I was so excited about Dazzler joining that team, and then when I heard that that happened, I was like, ugh. And then when I read it, I was like, ah! Contrary to the last point, this one was very unexpected. Obviously with Hellfire Gala, I kind of already knew what happened even though I hadn't read it yet. This one caught me unawares. It's because it was one of the first fights that we saw during the Ten of Swords Otherworld tournament, and I honestly had expectations going into this event that were instantly shattered here. Pardon my pun there. Sorry, Betsy. In this first fight of the tournament, Captain Britain's Betsy Braddock was forced to face off against Morocco's champion, Iska the Unbeaten. Iska gets her name from her mutant powers, which prevent her from ever losing. And while I expected that Betsy might be the first one to, pull off such a feat and make Iska lose, since she was the hero in this scenario and Iska, at the time, was the villain, it turns out I was wrong. And true to her name, Iska made short work of Betsy, literally shattering her into thousands of pieces. Yeah, I didn't see that one coming. I feel like wait, what just happened pretty much sums up Ten of Swords as an event. It's just bonkers. Bonkers I think in a good way, but that's my opinion. Another battle that I wasn't expecting to go how it did was the one with Uranos versus, well, pretty much all of Morocco, to be honest. But more specifically for this point, I'm talking about the Eternals villain facing off against Magneto, who is of course usually a villain of the X-Men, but in X-Men Red is really more of a hero here. Magneto here seemingly holds his own at first, but in the end has his heart removed by Uranos and is left for dead. It's also a pretty quick fight. It's like brutally quick. It's a seemingly gruesome end for a long-standing character, but what's even more intense is it would shortly after, in the same issue, be revealed that Magneto was so committed to getting revenge here, so willful, that he refused to die, using his powers in place of his heart to move his blood through his body and will himself to keep going so he could live to get revenge on Uranos for what he had done to mutant kind and planet Morocco. Heartless Magneto is scary Magneto. This death of a character I'm about to touch upon though is an honest real one. Synch was long dead up until recently in the comics. Thankfully, he was one of the first that the mutant nation of Krakoa brought back, prioritizing his resurrection so that he might be acclimatized and prepared for his mission in the vault alongside Darwin and Laura Kinney's Wolverine. Before his mission there, however, which he miraculously survived, he gave his life to protect others when Emma Frost's school for young mutants was attacked. This was his previous death. Tragic. Generation X, let's go. What makes his death in Generation X even more brutal is the fact that Synch gave his life to basically save other human kids who also attended the school, even though many of the human kids there were pretty unkind to the mutant student body they were forced to share the school with. Another heartbreaking defeat that I found to be extremely shocking and brutal was the loss of Captain Kate Pryde. And Lockheed, poor Lockheed, though fortunately Lockheed, his life was not lost. We must protect Lockheed at all costs. This all went down in the first volume of Marauders, a series that constantly pushed the envelope I felt for what we expect of these characters while also staying true to them. Kate was the leader of this new Marauders team, making her pretty much the main character of the series. So seeing her lost at sea at the hands of Sebastian Shaw was devastating, especially when you consider this happened only in issue 6 of this series. Yeah, just taking everything we thought we knew about what was going on and flipping the script. While a lot of the times we talk about the events of House of M and M-Day as being like the worst things mutants have ever lived through, there was a moment that was even more a brutal loss for Marvel Mutants in comparison, I'd wager. One that also cost millions of lives. Millions of lives. I think actually M-Day only cost million, and not even lives, just depowering individuals. But in this case, these people were wiped off the face of the earth. Cassandra Nova returned to get her revenge and ended up killing Donald Trask III in one of the most disturbing ways I've ever seen in a comic, while also merging with him, able to use his voice after his death to command the Master Mold and Sentinels. During the E is for Extinction story, Nova unleashed these Sentinels on Genosha, resulting in what we refer to today as the Genosian Massacre, which cost mutant kind an estimated 16 million lives. Yeah. Doing far more damage than M-Day and making M-Day even more devastating as a result when it did happen, since the mutants' numbers were already severely reduced going into the House of M event because of course, the Genosian Massacre. Like if the Genosian Massacre hadn't have happened, we would have had more mutants even after M-Day because there'd just be more people in general. So even though many of them would have been depowered, we still would have had a lot left.
Coming in at number 10, Hank McCoy, the brilliant scientist and agile mutant known as Beast, took a leave of absence from the X-Men, though his reasons were different from those of his teammates. After graduating from Xavier's school, Beast pursued a career in genetic research, driven by his insatiable curiosity and his desire to understand the very nature of mutation. He sought to use his intellect to improve the lives of mutants, but his thirst for knowledge, his desire to push the boundaries of science, would eventually lead him down a darker path, one that would bring him back to the X-Men in a very different capacity. Beast's story serves as a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the noblest intentions can be corrupted by ambition and the pursuit of knowledge without ethical boundaries. At number 9, Rogue, the Southern Belle with the power to absorb the powers, memories, and even personalities of others through touch, has also sought refuge from the X-Men. Her power, while formidable, is also a curse. After a traumatic experience where she permanently absorbed Ms. Marvel's powers and memories, Rogue was left adrift, struggling with her own identity and her place within the team. She questioned whether she could ever have a normal life, a normal relationship, free from the fear of accidentally hurting someone she cared about. But Rogue's story is not one of despair. It's a story of resilience. She found support and understanding within the X-Men, particularly from Gambit, and with the help of her fellow mutants and through rigorous training and self-discovery, Rogue eventually learned to control her powers, to embrace her unique abilities, and to forge her own identity as a hero. Taking the number 8 spot, Jean Grey, the powerful telepath and telekinetic whose connection to the Phoenix Force has defined much of her life, has had her own complex relationship with retirement. After sacrificing herself to save the universe from the destructive power of the Dark Phoenix, Jean was eventually resurrected, but the trauma of her experiences, the sheer terror of losing control to the Phoenix's immense power, left deep scars. She sought a life away from the constant battles and the ever-present threat of the Phoenix Force, a life where she could simply be Jean Grey, not a cosmic entity or a superhero. She even retired her codename Marvel Girl, choosing to embrace her own identity, separate from the expectations and burdens that came with being a member of the X-Men. Jean's connection to the Phoenix Force is a powerful metaphor for the burdens of great power and the struggle for control. Flying in at number 7, Archangel, Warren Worthington III, the high-flying mutant with majestic feathered wings, endured a horrific transformation into Archangel, Apocalypse's horseman of death. This traumatic experience left him scarred, both physically and mentally, forcing him to battle his inner darkness as he struggled to reconcile his two personas, the benevolent angel and the ruthless Archangel. His retirement was a period of intense self-reflection and a desperate attempt to regain control of his life. The duality of his nature, the constant struggle between his inherent goodness and the darkness imposed upon him, makes Archangel's journey one of the most compelling in X-Men history. Securing the number 6 position, Colossus. Pyotr Rasputin, the gentle giant with the power to transform his body into organic steel, was a stalwart member of the X-Men for many years, but he also experienced profound loss and betrayal, particularly during the era of the Legacy Virus, a deadly disease that targeted mutants. The death of his sister Ileana from the virus deeply affected him, leading him to question his role as a hero and to seek solace in a life away from the constant fighting. Colossus's retirement was a period of mourning, a time for him to grapple with the immense losses he'd suffered and to try to find meaning in a world that seemed determined to take everything from him. Coming in at number 5, Cyclops, Scott Summers. Cyclops, the steadfast leader of the X-Men. Cyclops' relationship with retirement is complicated, to say the least. After the devastating events of the Dark Phoenix saga, a heartbroken Cyclops retired to Alaska, seeking solace and a new beginning. He found love again with Madeline Pryor, and they started a family together. But the world of the X-Men is rarely peaceful. When Jean was revealed to be alive, Cyclops made a controversial decision. He abandoned his wife and newborn child to rejoin the X-Men, drawn back to the life he thought he'd left behind. He later joined X-Factor. This moment highlights a recurring theme in Cyclops' life: the difficult choices he's forced to make as a leader, choices that often come at a high personal cost. Blasting into number 4, Gambit. Remy LeBeau, the charming Cajun thief with the ability to charge objects with explosive kinetic energy, has always been a complex character, walking a fine line between hero and rogue. He even served as Death, one of Apocalypse's horsemen, for a time, a period that forced him to confront his own inner darkness and the destructive potential of his powers. His departures from the X-Men were often driven by his own internal conflicts, and his struggle to reconcile his past with his desire to be a hero. Gambit's story is a reminder that even the most charismatic individuals can harbor deep secrets and struggle with their own morality. Phasing in at number 3, Kate Pryde, the phasing mutant whose ability to walk through walls is just one facet of her incredible journey. From the bright-eyed innocent Kitty Pryde to the seasoned battle-hardened Shadowcat and then Captain Kate Pryde, she's been a mainstay of the X-Men for over 40 years. But even Kate had her reasons for stepping away from the team. The Krakoan era was a period of intense moral ambiguity and difficult choices for the X-Men, and Kate was right in the middle of it. She was forced to make decisions that went against her very nature, even resorting to killing in order to protect her people. This trauma took a heavy toll. She longed for the simpler times, the youthful optimism and joy she felt before the weight of leadership and the darkness of war became too heavy a burden to bear. But like a moth to a flame, Kate couldn't stay away from the fight for mutant survival forever. With the fall of Krakoa and the rise of new threats, she's returned to protect her people, this time as a mentor to a new generation of heroes. But her time away wasn't spent idle. In a surprising move, Kate joined the Guardians of the Galaxy and even took on the mantle of Star-Lord, just missing the top spot. At number 2, Cable. Nathan Summers, the time-traveling soldier from a dystopian future, dedicated his life to preventing the horrors he'd witnessed from ever coming to pass. He battled his evil clone, Strife, across time, a conflict that consumed him for years. His retirements were often brief interludes between missions, a chance to regroup and prepare for the next battle in his never-ending war against the forces that threatened to destroy the future. Cable's entire existence is a testament to the enduring struggle against fate and the sacrifices required to protect the future. He is a soldier out of time, a man burdened by the knowledge of what could be, forever fighting to change it. And finally, the moment you've all been waiting for, the number 1 retired X-Man is Wolverine, Logan. The best there is at what he does, and what he does isn't very nice. This gruff, ageless Canadian with adamantium claws and a healing factor that just won't quit is practically the poster child for the tormented X-Man. After decades of fighting alongside the X-Men, experiencing more loss and bloodshed than any one person should have to endure, even Wolverine needed a break. The physical toll was immense. Hugh Jackman, who brilliantly portrayed Wolverine in the X-Men movies, even admitted that the physicality of the role was hurting him. But Wolverine's retirement wasn't just about physical exhaustion. It was about the emotional and psychological burden of being a perpetual soldier in a seemingly endless war. He was tired of the cycle of violence, the constant rebuilding and reboots that the X-Men seemed to be trapped in. In the film Logan, a possible future is depicted where a weary older Wolverine has retired from the X-Men, working as a limo driver and caring for an ailing Professor X. But did Wolverine truly find peace in retirement? The answer, as fans well know, is a resounding no. Thanks to Deadpool, Wolverine is set to return to the big screen in Deadpool and Wolverine, and in the comics, he's right back in the thick of it.
And at number 10, what if Professor X had become the Juggernaut? From What If issue 13 volume 2, here we have a story in which Charles Xavier becomes the Juggernaut. It's a simple answer to what would happen. Xavier ends up getting buried alive, but the consequences are much greater. Because of this, he's never able to create the X-Men, leaving the Fantastic Four responsible for taking on Magneto. It gets worse, snowballing into some major anti-mutant hysteria. Eventually, Xavier manages to dig himself out of the ground, but it's too late for him to try to change the world for the better. He ends up using his super strength combined with his powerful psychic abilities to take over the US and enforce anti-human laws, using the X-Men to do so. In the process, he ends up defeating a lot of major Marvel characters, including the Fantastic Four, Spider-Man, Doctor Doom, Iron Man, Daredevil, and even the Hulk. Russia then tries to bomb the US, which is the catalyst for World War III. Xavier steps up, finding a way to make the Earth livable despite all the damage from the bomb, and ends up becoming the supreme leader of the planet. His only ask? That mutants aren't treated like crap. More mutants are born thanks to the bomb radiation, making up almost half of the planet's population. But despite the world finding some sort of peace, Xavier has gone mad, and in secret the remaining heroes and superpowered characters plot his demise, no longer believing in his dream since mutants now openly terrorize humans. This leads to a clash between Xavier and several of the X-Men on Asteroid M, with Quicksilver using explosives to launch Xavier into space, a potentially temporary solution that leaves Cyclops, Jean Grey, Scarlet Witch, and Quicksilver with the responsibility of trying to repair the world in the meantime. Talk about a hefty storyline. And at number 9, what if Wolverine had lived during the age of Conan the Barbarian? Conan Conan the Barbarian has made many an appearance in What If comics over the years. In this story though, which appears in What If Volume 2 Issue 16, Wolverine is transported to another time. Within the first few panels he slays a T-Rex, impressing the locals. He finds himself completely immersing himself in the culture, getting a new outfit, and not understanding a damn word that anyone is saying. Eventually he crosses paths with Conan, a battle ensues, and Conan slits Wolverine's throat. Thinking he's killed him, he walks away, but little does he know that Wolverine has a mutant healing factor. He pursues him, more shenanigans ensue, and Wolverine ends up staying in Conan's world, with Conan being teleported back out to where the X-Men are battling on the moon. And he also ends up with Sonya, who looks just like Jean Grey apparently. Oh, redheads. In at number 8, What If? X-Men Wedding Album. Issue 60 from Volume 2 of the What If series explored a specific theme. It contains a slew of stories related to Cyclops and Jean Grey's relationship, exploring different facets and possibilities. There's What If Scott Summers and Jean Grey had married earlier, which sees the couple marrying earlier on during the beginnings of the mutant team. Another one is What If Scott Summers and Jean Grey had never fallen in love at all, which results in Cyclops leaving the X-Men team altogether. Then there's What If Phoenix had fallen for Wolverine, perhaps the most tragic tale of them all, which involves the X-Men disbanding, ultimately thanks to the fact that all of the characters die. The framing for the entire issue revolves around the mainstream Earth 616 continuity of Jean and Scott, particularly pertaining to X-Men Volume 2 Issue 30, in which the two have their wedding. And at 7, What If Cable had destroyed the X-Men? This one comes from What If Volume 2 Issue 46, which was released in 1993. Its narrative follows Charles Xavier returning to Earth after being on a hiatus, only to discover that his X-Men teams have all strayed significantly. He holds meetings with each of the teams only to get into a fight with Cable, in which a battle ensues. Some side with Xavier while others side with Cable, and Cable ends up fleeing. Later on he assassinates Xavier along with Jean Grey and Scott Summers, killing them when they least expect it by launching a siren bomb at their dinner table. This causes a major disturbance between the members of all the X teams, dividing them, causing them to fight amongst themselves. In the meantime, the teams outside of the mutant-based ones are forced to pick up the slack. The Avengers and Fantastic Four are fighting off typical X-Men villains since the X-Men are too busy beating each other up instead. There's a massive fight and Wolverine's team of mutants clashes with Cable's team, killing Cable and his pals. Everything kind of falls apart there, with Magneto swooping in to try to get the remaining members of these battle-worn teams to join up with him. And talk about being an opportunist. Can you blame him though? And at 6, What If Wolverine was an agent of S.H.I.E.L.D.? This one might be my personal favorite. From What If Volume 2 Issue 7, first released in 1989, here we have Wolverine, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. The timeline diverges from the 616 timeline after Wolverine encounters the Wendigo with the Hulk. After that battle, he goes on loan to S.H.I.E.L.D. for a single mission to help them retrieve a stolen LMD tech. Hydra of course is the culprit behind the theft. Nick Fury and Wolverine hunt down the LMD robots and destroy them, one of which includes a decoy of Dum Dum Dugan. Upset about this revelation, Fury sends Wolverine and Black Widow to hunt down any other LMDs possibly infiltrating S.H.I.E.L.D. Turns out half of the crew on board of their ship were robots. The trio then set out to hit Hydra's base and rescue the real Dum Dum, which has them crossing paths with Madame Hydra and Baron von Strucker, who is in possession of the Satan Claw. A brawl ensues, with S.H.I.E.L.D. being victorious. Fury then offers Wolverine a spot permanently on the team, and Logan, wanting a change of pace, agrees. It's around this time on 616 that he'd be joining up with the X-Men anyway. Logan rises in the ranks, becoming Fury's number 2, and later on, Fury is murdered by a Strucker LMD seeking revenge, who takes him out in his flying Ferrari nonetheless. Gotta love the 80s. At Fury's funeral, Dum Dum retires, which makes Logan the new director of S.H.I.E.L.D. This has a powerful domino effect on the world. Using S.H.I.E.L.D., Wolverine prevents several major events in the Marvel Universe, including the creation of Sentinels, Dark Phoenix's emergence, there's no Mutant Registration Act, and overall it improves human and mutant relations for the better. Kind of hurts to see the potential Logan had at S.H.I.E.L.D., doesn't it? But on a different note, fun fact, another story in this issue is what if Aunt May was a mutant with claws? So I mean, that's one hell of a reminder that this is a what if issue. In at number 5, What If the X-Men Had Stayed in Asgard? Based on the comic New Mutants Special Edition Issue 1, What If the X-Men Had Stayed in Asgard is a riff off of a story in which concluded with them leaving Asgard to return to Earth. The premise is very self-explanatory here. The X-Men all vote, and those who wish to leave are sent home by Loki. The rest of the story follows the lives of these remaining X-Men and how they assimilate into Asgardian culture. Rogue finds love, being able to touch the Asgardian people. Mirage becomes a Valkyrie. Storm becomes the goddess of thunder, and Loki attempts to trick her into slaying his brother, who has been transformed into a frog. Hela then attacks Asgard, and the X-Men alongside Thor, who is eventually transformed back to his normal self, fight her and her army. They defeat her and Thor returns to Earth, giving Storm the throne and Asgard to rule. And Loki? Well, for the tricks that he played in getting the X-Men to stay, he slowly goes mad by the end of the comic, thanks to the ones who sit above in shadow. Moving on to number 4, what if the new X-Men had died on their very first mission? Coming out of What If Volume 2 Issue 9, this comic book has a wonderful cover. It's Charles Xavier being pushed away from the X-Men's funeral by Beast, shouting out up into the heavens, "The X-Men are dead and I killed them!" The concept for this one places the original X-Men and the new X-Men being killed off on their mission, with Xavier telepathically feeling each and every one of their deaths. Beast, the only X-Men member to not have gone on this mission, tries to console the depressed Xavier. Count Nefaria sees how weakened the X-Men are and attacks, which forces Beast into forming a new ragtag team that consists of himself, Scarlet Witch, Quicksilver, Siren, Warpath, and Namorita, the female version of Namor. This new team end up fighting and defeating Count Nefaria, and Xavier, seeing this new team all put together, begins to come out of his depression, asking the new team to stay on and become official X-Men. All works out for the best. I mean, except, all of the original ones are dead, but hey. Moving on to number 3, what if Wolverine had killed the Hulk? From What If Volume 1 Issue 13, we see a rehashing of Wolverine's first appearance in the comics, when he first crossed paths with the Hulk in the Incredible Hulk issue 181. Although he technically made a cameo in the issue prior, but cameo. It was like in a panel. Now in that story, Wolverine and the Hulk initially see each other as a threat before teaming up together to take down the Wendigo. But in this story though, Wolverine and the Hulk duke it out. And rather than being interrupted by the Wendigo, which initially causes them to stop fighting each other, the Wendigo never shows up. This ends up resulting in Wolverine fatally wounding the Hulk, and leads to him fleeing from authorities despite his attacks being out of self-defense. Because he's on the run, he doesn't join the X-Men. Instead, he teams up with Magneto and joins the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, with his first assignment being to infiltrate the X-Men. He does, but in the process grows close to the mutant team, and when the time comes for him to double-cross them, he just can't do it. Instead, he turns on Magneto, and Magneto and Wolverine fight, with them killing each other in the process. And at number 2, what if Wolverine was Lord of the Vampires? This one's great. Here's a what if story that should be familiar to some of you who frequent our channel. From What If Volume 2 Issue 24, what if Wolverine was Lord of the Vampires? Tells the tale of Wolverine and the X-Men crossing paths with none other than Count Dracula. The two fight, and Wolverine gets bitten, becoming a vampire himself. But thanks to his willpower, he's able to evade Dracula's mind control abilities, and ends up fighting him for dominance. Wolverine succeeds and kills him, and then proceeds to transform all of the other X-Men into vampires, with him and his new army going around biting beloved heroes and draining them of their blood. Eventually, for some reason that I swear totally makes sense, Doctor Strange has taken over the body of the Punisher and goes after Wolverine, and manages to get through to Logan in the end, stopping his blood reign of terror. And finally, and at number 1, what if Phoenix had not died? From What If Issue 27 Volume 1, we see the Watcher looking into an alternate reality in which Jean Grey did not die during the incursion with the Shi'ar. Rather, she was reborn. And when the X-Men find themselves facing off against Galactus and Terrax in the Shi'ar galaxy, the Phoenix rises and kicks some serious butt, stopping Galactus. But something is not right. Jean Grey is overwhelmed by the Phoenix Force and ends up losing control, destroying a star. Once back home on Earth at the X-Mansion, Kitty Pryde confronts Jean about the star that she destroyed. This does not bode well. Jean loses it and becomes Dark Phoenix, killing Kitty in response. The X-Men attempt to stop her, but her rampage continues. She ends up killing Polaris. Cyclops tries to intervene too, but Phoenix murders him as well. And it only gets worse from there. Jean entirely loses control and the Phoenix Force engulfs the entire world, destroying it, with it continuing to expand in the universe, consuming it all bit by bit. Talk about depressing.
Number 10, Forearm. This villain was a member of the Mutant Liberation Front who frequently came up against members of the New Mutants and X-Force, as well as occasionally the X-Men. Although many of the other members of this team vary from appearance to appearance, Forearm is a mainstay of the group. So, what can he do? Well, he has some increased durability, strength, and stamina, but as the name would suggest, his main ability is that he has 4 arms. He eventually left the Mutant Liberation Front once he discovered that his fellow teammate and girlfriend Moonstone was really an undercover S.H.I.E.L.D. agent. He was seen participating in the Bloodsport Championship, where he was killed by a member of the Serpent Society named Anaconda. But he later appeared alive and well with no explanation as a new member of a New Mutant Liberation team before eventually being welcomed to the New Mutant island of Koa and later joining S.W.O.R.D. and Magic's Dark Riders.
Number 9, Mr. Sinister. It feels strange putting Mr. Sinister so low on this list, considering how truly unbelievable he is. I mean, Just look at him. And then go back and look at his first appearance. Remember when Sinister had sharp teeth? That was a time. Mr. Sinister has always been an unbelievable villain, not just because of his striking and unusual appearance, but because of his obsession with the Summers family, particularly Scott, and later because of his long-standing involvement with both the Summers and the Greys, as well as an origin that attached him to them when they traveled to the past, as well as an origin that tied him to Apocalypse. And now it's gotten even more unbelievable, with Mr. Sinister not just being one, but possibly existing as 4 separate entities, each belonging to their own unique race. Like, what is even happening with this man? He's crazy. At least no matter how unbelievable he continues to get, he will always look fabulous while doing it. That is something that I think in the comics is a guarantee. And friends, before we move on to our next spot on this list, if you love what we do here at Top 10 Nerd, why not click that subscribe button? We know a lot of you are not subscribed, and you know what? Every time you click that subscribe button, a host gets their wings. So if you click it, maybe I'll just randomly start sprouting wings. Might not be on camera, but it'll happen eventually.
Number 8. Skinless Man. One of the more visually repellent villains on this list, Skinless Man was originally Harry Pizer, a mutant during the Cold War with elastic and multisensory skin, which allowed him to be an efficient spy and member of the Weapon Plus program. They augmented his strength and made his skin more durable and elastic and gave him the name Weapon 3. He was sent to obtain a weapon called the Orb of Necromancy, but was shot and left for dead by Phantomex and captured by the Captain Britain Corps, who removed his skin. Phantomex later stole his skin to create bullets that were sentient and therefore never missed. Pizer taught his muscle to imitate the powers his skin had had and became a villain, being recruited to the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. He typically fights X-Force rather than the X-Men, but honestly, potato potato. He is pretty unbelievable just because, I mean, look at him. What the hell? He eventually died in Uncanny X-Force number 34.
Number 7. Cassandra Nova. Cassandra Nova is one of the strangest, but also maybe in a weird twist, greatest X-Men villains ever. She is the evil twin of Professor Xavier that we never knew existed originally. But really, she isn't like a straight up evil twin. She is what's known as a Mumadrai, which is an evil reflection of ourselves. The alien race known as the Shi'ar believe we must fight and defeat our Mumadrai in order to be born successfully into the world. Yeah, it's a pretty wild concept. And also a weird one to apply to an Earthling like Xavier or even other people on Earth, considering, you know, this is a Shi'ar belief and ultimately a kind of a Shi'ar thing. But who says that Shi'ar's beliefs can't be true for other planets or Earthlings, I guess? Especially when Xavier would grow up to have such close ties to the Empire, even at one time becoming the consort of Lilandra Naramani, the ruler and magistrix of the Shi'ar Empire. And it gets even weirder. Not only did Professor X defeat Cassandra in the womb before being born, meaning his X gene was activated in utero, but she also somehow survived this encounter, likely thanks to the strength of the man that she was a doppel of. Cassandra survived for years as basically a kind of like a puddle of goo and would eventually return. And she's still around now, having been cured of her hatred towards mutants and even teaming up with the Mutant Marauders hero team on Krakoa in the modern day, which also is super weird, but I love it.
Number 6. Mojo. So, Mojo is a member of a race called the Spineless, who can't move without the help of motorized platforms. They were all driven insane by waves of energy that turned out to be television signals. Their government is based on the structure of the television industry, and Mojo is its leader, calling the world Mojo World and their universe the Mojoverse. Everyone on Mojo World is addicted to a gladiator-like sports show, and Mojo does everything he can to keep the ratings up. Some of his more infamous plots were when he replaced Psylocke's eyes with cameras so he could broadcast everything she saw to his people, or when he transformed the X-Men into children and later cloned them and made the X-Babies, who he hoped he could control. Honestly, every sentence about this guy makes less sense than the last, and his entire deal seems to be just really broad and surface level criticism of the entertainment industry, so I'm just gonna move on now.
Number 5. Lucifer. Lucifer has always been a really weird one for me from the comics, another enemy to Professor Charles Xavier. This nemesis was originally attributed with paralyzing Charles, forcing him to be confined to a wheelchair. Initially, it was implied through mysterious illusions that Lucifer may actually be Satan himself. This was when Charles left the X-Men team in the care of Cyclops when he went on his own mission. Xavier did this following the students' graduation from his school, believing they were ready to be left on their own when it came to heroics, leaving Cyclops in charge. When Cyclops did reach out to him during his mission, Charles answered, as we saw in the comics, from a dark dark, kind of fiery looking cavern that he seemed to be lowering himself further into. There wasn't actual fire in these panels, I don't think, but definitely I feel like there was some red lighting happening. Also the fact that the character's name was Lucifer, who Charles was in pursuit of. However, we later learned that Lucifer was not in fact Satan incarnate, but instead an alien trying to help his race conquer the Earth? Huh?
Number 4. Mammomax. Maximus Jensen's mutation is very off and kind of vague. He is a man who was either born or transformed into an elephant man. He has big tusks which he uses to attack his foes, has the strength of an elephant, which I guess kinda goes without saying, and has nearly invulnerable skin. Like all elephants, he has the ability to spit acid at people as well. What's that? Elephants don't do that? Well then, that's kind of a random ability for him to have, isn't it? He was a member of the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, joining because he thought he'd get to hang out with tough Magneto-trained mutants. He was disappointed with the roster he got stuck with, and was presumably even more disappointed when he and the Brotherhood got stranded in Mojo World. He was eventually captured by the Facility, where he was eaten by a monster, but he was later resurrected by the Five in Krakoa. Now, I have no issue with an elephant villain, but the idea of someone being mutated to just be an elephant is pretty unbelievable, even for the X-Men.
Number 3. Moira McTaggart. Possibly one of the most shocking villains on our list is Moira McTaggart. Moira isn't unbelievable in the sense of being ridiculous or being weird, she is more shocking in the fact of her actual allegiances and origins, which have recently been revealed. For years, Moira has been established as a friend of the X-Men, a human ally who believes that mutants deserve equal rights. But we would later learn the truth, that Moira herself is actually a mutant. And then we'd later learn again that despite her actually also being a mutant, which you'd think would make her more allied with the X-Men, she is no longer an ally to the X-Men, but one of their #1 enemies. What? Moira would even join up with the deadly and influential organization known as Orchis, which aims to put an end to mutants in an effort to preserve and safeguard humanity. Moira herself has kind of been stripped of her mutant genes and powers and turned into a bit of a cyborg, but this hasn't stopped her from continuing in her fight against mutant kind, in a shocking comic book twist.
Number 2. Nimrod. Nimrod here comes from the Days of Future Past alternate future, where mutant hunting sentinels controlled North America. He is an advanced prototype of the program who tried to follow Rachel Summers into the past after her and Kate Pryde were discovered during a sabotage mission. He ended up undershooting his destination by about 20 years, where he killed Storm and forced Forge to build him a time machine, which took him to the current Marvel timeline, where he came into contact with and fought the X-Men on several occasions, eventually merging with the remains of the Master Mold and becoming Bastion. What I find so unbelievable about the character is that anyone would be scared of someone called Nimrod. In case you are not aware, Nimrod was the name of a legendary and skilled hunter from the Bible, so it is obviously implying that this Nimrod is designed to hunt mutants really efficiently. However, because Bugs Bunny would often sarcastically refer to Elmer Fudd as Nimrod in the old Looney Tunes cartoons, its meaning evolved in the general lexicon to mean an idiot. So as unbelievable as it sounds, a cartoon bunny has made me incapable of viewing this villain as threatening, because to the general public, he is calling himself an idiot.
Number 1. Ice Cream. Ice Cream has to be one of the weirdest mutant villains of all time, considering that his plan was to basically use his mutant power to turn into ice cream and then infiltrate the X-Men, and I guess I'm not really sure what his plan was here. He basically wanted revenge on the X-Men because he was jealous of how amazing their abilities were in comparison to his own. So I don't know how he thought he was gonna do that, because he's just a guy that could turn into ice cream, but yeah. Ice Cream was a very short-lived villain, not appearing specifically in X-Men, but simply as a villain to the team in issue number 1 of Obnoxio the Clown, which in all regards is also an extremely unbelievable comic that happened. In the end, his plan failed dramatically, and he got eaten by the clown who had been hired to come and celebrate Kitty Pryde's birthday. This is a strange time for everyone, but I imagine it was especially a strange time for Ice Cream. Also, I don't think he turns into a full ice cream. He also turns into a sundae, which, how is that? Is that part of it? Is he the banana as well? I am the banana. Number 10. Hulk Smash? X-Men? This happened during World War Hulk. Hulk had been sent to Sakaar and believed that the Illuminati were not only responsible for sending him off-world, but also for destroying the planet that he had made his new home and his future family there as well. Coming back to Earth and pissed, he began to hunt down all members of the Illuminati, including those who weren't even at the meeting. Enter Charles Xavier. While Charles was not one of the members to condemn the Hulk as he was not in attendance, Hulk still wanted to know what Charles would have voted had he been there. Charles told him the truth, that he also would have voted to send Hulk off-world. Hulk wanted to hold Charles accountable for what he saw as his potential crimes, since, Charles didn't actually vote, but before he could take him away, the X-Men stepped in to defend the professor. Hulk then began to beat down any and all mutants or allies who would stand in his way. It was a slaughter. All this despite the fact that Charles wasn't even there, and these mutants really didn't have a say in the matter of Hulk being sent off-world to begin with. In the end, Hulk was shamed into stopping his attack and leaving Xavier be by the mutant Mercury. Thank goodness. Number 9. Schism. Schism isn't necessarily a bad idea on paper, but it was one of the darkest moments in X-Men history, so in a way it was the worst for the mutants themselves, in terms of in-canon, as opposed to, us readers. What went down here? Well, Cyclops and Wolverine fought and created a huge split down the middle between mutant kind, especially mutant students, as each had their own beliefs when it came to as how best to shape these young minds. What might seem odd about Schism is that it was about a divide between Psyche and Wolvie, who are not really known for being super friendly anyways, due to their infighting about, who should get a date Jean Grey. However, it should also be noted that Cyclops and Wolverine, despite both loving Jean, are actually considered to be pretty close and are good friends. That is until they get into a disagreement about how best to teach young mutants. Like I said, they've gotten into a lot of disagreements before that, but this one was pretty big. Wolverine thinks that they should be treated as kids, and Cyclops thinks they should be trained as soldiers. What makes it worse is just as a Sentinel attacks the mutant island of Utopia, Cyclops and Wolverine decided to fight one another over the differentiating standpoints as opposed to dealing with the Sentinels, which is, I know you guys are having a fight, but like a Sentinel's attacking? I feel like we should deal with that first. Number 8. Cyclops recruits X-23 for X-Force. X-Force is a team that is sometimes referred to as the X-Men Black Ops team. They go in and do the jobs that others are not willing to do. The more shady and morally questionable heroic stuff. X-Force originally started as Cable's team that went around dealing with situations and taking out people that basically Cable thought needed to be handled. But from there would evolve into a secret X-Men team that handled assassinations and less desirable jobs. At one point, it's Cyclops who puts the team together during the mutants' time on Utopia. He appoints Wolverine the leader, but also puts X-23 on the team against Logan's wishes. This is because X-23, Laura Kinney, has only known killing pretty much her whole life. She was made to be a weapon, and Logan wanted her to have a say moving forward in what she did with her life. He didn't want her to have to feel like she always had to be a weapon. She could be more than that. But Cyclops feels she's too useful to not have on the team. Needless to say, it was not a good look for Psyche, and Logan was pretty pissed. Number 7. The first live-action Juggernaut. While the version of Juggernaut from the Deadpool franchise appears relentless in a really great way, the first attempt at the character on screen was not so great. Even the actor that played Juggernaut in the Fox X-Men franchise, Vinnie Jones, appearing in X-Men The Last Stand, supposedly claimed he was even disappointed with the portrayal as well. The problem with this version of Juggy was that he wasn't really intimidating enough. Also, that outfit. I don't think it works great on camera. If it weren't for the Juggernaut's displays of easily smashing through walls, I feel like we'd have a hard time recognizing him here, even with him clearly stating who he is to the audience while he's in pursuit of Kitty Pryde. Number 6. Inhumans vs. X-Men. Possibly one of the weirdest storylines we've ever gotten, especially as Inhumans were kind of attempted to be utilized before in the comics to be like a backup to the X-Men. Not saying I don't love the Inhumans, by the way, but after Marvel sold the rights of the X-Men to Fox, they basically made an attempt to kind of catapult the Inhumans into popularity, and that really just didn't work out too well. The Inhumans were made by the Kree and were modified humans who basically get powers through a process called Terrigenesis, where they're exposed to Terrigen mists. They usually keep to themselves themselves, so to have them fight any mutant group feels kind of weird straight out of the gate. The reasoning between them and the X-Men having beef? Well, it turns out that apparently Terrigen Mists are like poison to mutant kind, and despite the Inhumans attempting to work things out and come to some kind of peaceful resolution when mutant kind were accidentally hurt by mists released on Earth because they actually felt pretty bad about it, the two groups ended up in a war. What makes it even worse is that the catalyst for this war, the dramatic death of Cyclops at the hands, or rather the voice, of Black Bolt, is revealed to have been staged by Emma Frost to give mutants a reason to fight back against a group that never really wanted to fight to begin with. So what are we even talking about here? Number 5. Cyclops and Emma Frost make out on Jean Grey's grave. Oh boy. Yeah, there are a lot of things that have not been great when it comes to Cyclops' history. Sorry, Cyclops. I love you, Scott, but you do some questionable things, man. I mean, he's done a lot of good things, but he's also been part of some of the biggest scandals in all of mutant history. Case in point, his psychic affair with Emma Frost, and following that, his making out on Jean's grave with Emma after Jean had died. Wolverine certainly was not impressed with any of this. While many still ship and love Cyclops and Emma together, even many of the fans of the couple would agree it was a pretty weird moment. However, Jean's ghost gave the couple her blessing, so I guess we're just supposed to be cool with it. I mean, I guess if Jean's ghost is fine with it, then we're just supposed to be like, yeah, alright, why not? Make out on that grave. You guys are in love. It's cool. And friends, before we move on to this next spot, if you are loving this list and you want to see a part 2, because you know there's a lot of terrible things that have happened in X-Men history, please be sure to let us know by giving this video a thumbs up. Number 4. Professor X and Jean Grey. In particular, Professor X's initial feelings about Jean back in the Stan Lee, Jack Kirby days of the X-Men. We all know that Cyclops, aka Scott Summers, has always had a thing for Jean, but when it comes to the classic X-Men team, he actually wasn't the only one. In fact, pretty much everyone was head over heels for Jean at one point. Maybe except Bobby, who back in the day did like to flirt, but mainly was in love with ice cream. I mean, Bobby was the youngest of the bunch, and even me, not necessarily being the youngest of any bunch, I still love ice cream, so fair enough, Bobby. You eat that ice cream. Both Angel and Beast also seem to hold a bit of a flame for the lone female member of the X-Men team at that time, with Angel actually being pretty close at times to winning Jean's heart. But that's not where it ended. Even Charles Xavier, Jean's mentor and teacher, was apparently in love with her? Why is this so bad? While at the time the X-Men came across as more young adults at times than teenagers, in retrospect it would be established that Charles, as a grown man, had come to Jean's aid when her powers first manifested and shielded her from them with mental blocks to protect her from basically the sheer power that would otherwise probably have destroyed her. So she was maybe 8 or 10, I think, when this happened, and he was an adult? Okay. Add in the fact that even back in the 60s run, Charles was her professor and Jean was his student, and the fact that Professor X chiefly blamed his lack of ability to walk as a reason why he couldn't, nay shouldn't, be with Jean, and it's all kind of weird and pretty gross. Look, Charles, you don't have to walk for people to love you, but also don't have crushes on your students, it's weird. Number 3. Archangel and Husk. One of the strangest relationships to have ever existed in the X-Books. One of. Or at the very least, one of the most controversial was the one between Archangel and Husk. Why was it considered so weird? Well, Angel was one of the first ever X-Men on the original team back in the 60s. Now, time works weird in comics, I'll grant you that, but Husk was known to be the younger sister of Cannonball, who himself was a much later addition to the X-Men, first appearing almost 20 years after Angel on the New Mutants team in 1982. And Husk, Paige Guthrie, his younger sister, appeared 2 years later in 1984. She was believed to be in her late teens or maybe her early 20s, while Angel, although somewhat ageless, would likely be in his 30s at least, if not older, because yeah, he was around in the 60s, so we gotta do some fixing to make that make sense. And it was implied that he was quite a bit older throughout their relationship as well, just in the comics, in the context of the relationship and what they would say to each other. Add in the fact that these two got busy in the sky above the Guthrie family home, and yeah, you can see why this feels really problematic and weird. Number 2. X-Men Gold Controversy. Oh boy, the X-Men Gold Controversy. X-Men Gold was actually a series that many X-Men fans were really excited for at the time. It promised a fresh, new take on X-Men the fans were craving, but when it came out, the first issue's release was swept up in a whirlwind of controversy in regards to its first printing. This was because the artist, Archangel, who is said to have hidden political symbolism in the issue, which directly related to a protest in Indonesia against the Christian governor of Jakarta, known as Ahok. Overall, the protest was considered to be quite conservative in regards to political sides, and those protesting Ahok wanted him jailed for being a blasphemer when he referred to a passage in the Quran during his campaign. Now, he apologized for doing so, but people were still really angry about it, and Saif was supposedly among those at the protest and decided to include the political and religiously charged numbers in the first issue of the book, which are also said to stand for a passage that is interpreted in Indonesia speaking against accepting Jews or Christians as Muslim leaders. So even though apparently there were a lot of things that were misconstrued with all of that, it still was just not great. It's not great. Number 1. Genoshan Mutant Massacre. The history of Genosha has pretty much been tumultuous and widely awful since the start. The island nation prospered for most of its history thanks to mutants who were born there and once identified had their free will stripped of them, all their rights taken away, and were basically used as free laborers for the benefit of the nation, no longer being considered citizens but the property of the Genoshan government once they were identified as mutants. Pretty terrible stuff. Eventually, the mutants on the island would rise up with some help, but even after that, it would not be easy to set things right. There was a lot of fighting that happened on Genosha even after the mutants were kind of trying to get their rights back. At one point, Magneto got ownership of the island nation and attempted to turn it into a nation for mutant kind, a place mutants could call their own, reclaiming it and turning it into a little slice of paradise for them. An attempt at what we have kind of with Krakoa today. Hopefully it ends better for Krakoa though. For Genosha, millions of mutants were murdered on the island after it was attacked by Cassandra Nova's Wild Sentinels. It was a brutal and dark moment in mutant history, with the island being put on quarantine so that even those who did survive and tried to get away were ordered to be shot on sight. A lot of people like to focus on House of M and M-Day, but Genosha was a mass extinction mutant event, and it was a really brutal attack. To really understand this team, we have to go all the way back to their humble beginnings over at Marvel Comics. The team supposedly came to be thanks to a group you're quite familiar with. No, I'm not talking about Marvel, and no, I'm not talking about legendary duo Jack Kirby and Stan Lee. I'm talking about us, the fans. Well, I mean, not me specifically, as I was not alive back in 1963, but the fans who were around back then and reading comics had a need for more Marvel team books. There were many solo hero books out there, but fans wanted to see more team-ups, and so Stan Lee and Jack Kirby came up with the X-Men. Stan Lee had said before that the challenge with team books where new characters were introduced was explaining how they all got their powers, their origins. To simplify this, he had an idea of making the entire team a group of mutants, using that same blanketed reason to explain how they each got their powers. Pretty easy, you can just say, hey, they're mutants. The brilliance of this is that while on paper this sounds like an easy, even lazier approach to some, it actually worked. A huge part of the reason why the X-Men were so successful and why we love them even today is because of their mutant status. Initially, Stan wanted to give them a simple name, denoting this status, the Mutants. But publisher Martin Goodman turned down the name idea, citing the fact that no one knew what a mutant was. Some even believed that the name, the Mutants, could still be used as a good alternative name for the group when they debut in the MCU, but we'll have to wait to find out about that. Instead, Lee decided to take inspiration for the team's name from their leader and mentor, Professor X, calling them simply the X-Men. In those early comics created by Kirby and Lee, Professor Charles Xavier, or Professor X, as he'd come to be more commonly known, created a school for young mutants, guided by a dream of peaceful coexistence with humankind. You see, the public was not a fan of mutants, and there were many evil mutants out there that gave mutant kind a bad rap. To combat this, Professor X decided to create a school for gifted youngsters in Westchester County, New York, bringing together a team of young mutants using his telepathic abilities and Cerebro, which we later learned was actually created by X and his future student Jean Grey. The initial team and group of students that started it all were Cyclops, Beast, Angel, Iceman, and of course, Jean Grey as Marvel Girl. During these early days, they were also sometimes joined by Mimic, who initially was introduced as a deadly villain that could adopt the abilities and powers of those around him, making him a formidable foe for the X-Men, as he could, mimic all of their powers. However, Mimic would soon after be reformed, and after losing and regaining his powers kind of multiple times, would also end up adopting the OG X-Men roster's power sets permanently. These were the early days of the X-Men, which also introduced one of their greatest enemies, who coincidentally would also throughout the years become somewhat reformed before becoming a full-on anti-hero, or even to some, a full-on hero in modern day comics: Magneto, the master of magnetism, and his also quite infamous Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, who themselves would have many various different versions and rosters throughout the years. Eventually, the X-Men series was taken over by Roy Thomas, beginning with issue number 20. Throughout the continuation of the series, other writers would also help out, and we'd see characters like Havoc, Cyclops' heroically reluctant brother, who was also a mutant, and Polaris, who we later learn was the daughter of Magneto, having powers similar to him, introduced. This series would be ongoing until issue number 66, where it would come to a firm stop as sales dwindled somewhat. Up until issue 93 of the series, the X-Men title would only exist to sell reprints of older stories. So there's a period there where nothing new is really happening, it's just a lot of reprints. However, with Giant Size X-Men issue number 1, we'd see X-Men return in a big way, finally getting a new tale and ultimately a revival. Len Wein and Dave Cockrum were the creatives behind this first Giant Size, which would become a Marvel and X-Men staple. In fact, recently in 2020, we saw a new Giant Size X-Men series emerge in this similar vein, each issue of that series focusing on a story tied to a different X-Men. In the first ever Giant Size X-Men issue number 1 though, a whole new team of X-Men were introduced, featuring Colossus, Wolverine, Storm, Thunderbird, Banshee, Nightcrawler, and Sunfire. Oh, and Cyclops was also there. Although it should be noted, as I talk about the evolution of the roster, I likely won't mention all members every single time to avoid repetition. I'm also not going to mention every single roster because I could just do that in one video and that could be a whole video. Suffice it to say, there have been a lot of X-Men rosters that Scott Summers has been a part of as well. If he's not mentioned, he might still be on there. The difference between this team and the original X-Men team was that this team was a lot more grown up. The former youngsters had all grown up, and this team reflected that, with all new members also being adults as opposed to teens. The Giant Size roster was also unique in that each team member was radically different from the other, having a completely different background, power set, and in many cases even country of origin. This was probably the first roster to really reflect another trait many fans love about the X-Men today: diversity. In terms of the why behind this team, they were brought together to rescue the original X-Men from the deadly sentient mutant island known as Krakoa, currently actually an ally to the X-Men in modern day comics, but once a villain in their history. Technically wedged in between this rescue attempt and when the X-Men ended up in peril was another team initially led by Moira McTaggart, but outside of the canon in real world comic history, this team wouldn't be retconned into existence until the early 2000s. It would serve to help introduce the youngest Summers brother, the quote-unquote mystery Summers bro, Vulcan. But back to the Giant Size team. They were successful in their rescue mission, and afterwards were left to ask the question, now that all the X-Men were safe and sound, new and old, what are we going to do with 13 X-Men? Well, they wouldn't have to worry about this too much, as they weren't lucky number 13 for too long. Shortly afterwards, Sunfire left the team in a huff, Thunderbird died on a mission unfortunately, Iceman and Angel ultimately moved out of the X-Mansion, and Havoc and Polaris decided to go back to school. Jean Grey as well also left for a period, kind of returning to school, but her romantic connection to Scott Summers kept her mostly active on the team's roster. Jean would also eventually become the Phoenix, sending us down a path towards one of the most iconic X-Men stories, I would say, of all time, the Phoenix Saga, and of course the even more iconic follow-up story, the Dark Phoenix Saga. While the adult X-Men team continued on, there were newer mutants introduced, and a second X-Men title was added to make room for them and their stories. This new young team of teen mutants had a book whose title reflected just what they were, the New Mutants, in a way calling back to the simplicity of the title Stan Lee had originally thought up. This era is often considered one of the best among fans, with creative team Chris Claremont and John Byrne often standing out as the main folks we think of when we reflect back on these iconic moments and stories. In addition to the Phoenix Saga, there was also Days of Future Past and God Loves, Man Kills. Many of the stories you've seen brought to life in film and animated series adaptations are actually taken from this time period in mutant and X-Men history. Another spin-off title was added at this time to showcase the tales of the original X-Men roster, the most classic of teams. However, because we already had an X-Men team and title, this book and the team within its pages would become known instead as X-Factor. At that time, X-Factor was the old roster returning to action, not yet a mutant detective agency. Despite being what most fans associate with that name now, that version of X-Factor actually wouldn't become known to us until the early 2000s, with X-Factor Investigations making its first appearance in Madrox issue number 1 in 2004, which led into the 2005 X-Factor series, which is technically volume 3 of that series. Even more books would be added to what seemed to be developing as somewhat of an X-Men line, I would say. Excalibur appeared as part of Marvel UK's collection of comics. This comic featured 3 X-Men, Nightcrawler, Kitty Pryde, and Rachel Summers, who teamed up on adventures with Marvel UK superheroes Brian Braddock's Captain Britain and Megan. By the time we got to the 80s, we had a completely new roster of X-Men who were featured in the Uncanny X-Men title, which actually is considered to be a renamed portion of the X-Men Legacy series. This new roster featured Storm, Wolverine, Colossus, Rogue, Psylocke, Dazzler, Longshot, and Havoc, among others. Angel, Nightcrawler, Polaris, Banshee, and Kitty Pryde Sprite were also present, as was Professor X. This era featured one of my favorite X-Men story epics, Inferno. While the 80s were a pretty magical time for X-Men stories, the party came crashing to a halt somewhat in issue number 251 of Uncanny X-Men, when the team split up! Of course, no cliffhanger here for us living in the retrospective future, as we know the X-Men would and did return. In issue number 254, a new team revealed themselves, coming together on Muir Island, nearby to Scotland. This roster was made up of both mutants and humans, featuring Banshee, Polaris, Forge, Dr. Moira McTaggart, Professor X's son, Legion, Nightcrawler's magical foster sister and also romantic love interest, Amanda Sefton, Brigadier Sandy Stewart, who belonged to the Weird Happenings organization, aka WHO, Tom Corsi, Sharon Friedlander, and very briefly, Sunder. This mutant team is often referred to as the Muir Island X-Men. We were also introduced to supporting characters like the Muir Island Morlocks, including Callisto and Healer, and the Freedom Force, which initially featured Destiny, Mystique, and Valerie Cooper, but would kind of become like an alternate Brotherhood roster, to be honest. The core X-Men team, however, would stay pretty much broken up until issue number 270, when all mutants were brought together once more in Extinction Agenda to fight against the cyborg Cameron Hodge. Possibly one of the most famed X-Men creative teams of all time, started to sort out the current state of the X-Men and their fractured rosters as we moved into the 90s. Jim Lee and Chris Claremont. In issue number 273, we got a story called appropriately, Too Many Mutants. Truer words were never spoken, which aimed to rectify all the confusion by finally giving us a new X-Men roster featuring Storm, Wolverine, Psylocke, Jubilee, Gambit, Forge, and Banshee. By 1991, we saw the many mutants coming together once more to take on the evil psionic mastermind known as the Shadow King during the Muir Island saga. After that battle, however, we were once more left with the remnants of 3 teams all kind of jumbled together. The Muir Island X-Men, the X-Men X-Men, and X-Factor. Once again, at the end of X-Factor issue number 70, we were left with the question, this time asked by Professor X, what am I going to do with 14 X-Men? No one looks pleased either about this issue on the page where this question is asked, perhaps because they are all upset that Professor X has maybe forgotten them, as he seems to have miscounted, but I assume this is just supposed to be a play on the 13 and we're just one-upping it, because there's definitely people that are not included in that count, including some who are not pictured here, and you know, Professor X himself. There were likely even more than 14 X-Men now gathered. The solution to this question finally came in the form of creating multiple actual X-Men teams. Not spin-offs, but instead 2 main rosters. This is where the much-loved original X-Men Gold and Blue rosters come in, and this love is in fact proven by sales, with Jim Lee and Chris Claremont's X-Men issue number 1 being known as the best-selling comic of all time. At the time of this recording, there have been a reported over 8 million copies sold, which is pretty wild. The blue team featured Cyclops as leader, with Gambit, Rogue, Beast, Psylocke, Wolverine, and Jubilee rounding out the team's ranks, and briefly featuring Revanche as well. The blue team featured more of the edgy and newer X-Men characters, and was written and drawn by Chris Claremont and Jim Lee. Featured in the pages of the second volume of X-Men from 1991, starting of course with issue number 1. Although they wouldn't actually be the blue team until like a few issues later, in terms of like them just being the mainstay. Think about issue 4. The gold team, on the other hand, featured Storm as leader, with members including Colossus, Angel's Archangel, Bishop, Jean, Forge, and Iceman. This team was depicted as the more seasoned and experienced one, showcasing more of the classic X-Men of the 60s and 70s. This team's stories were told in the pages of Uncanny X-Men, kicking off with issue number 281 of the series. I personally love this cover. The creative team involved included John Byrne, Jim Lee, and Wilchi Portacio. The costumes showcased with both teams, designed by Jim Lee, became pretty iconic and served to inspire their looks in the 90s X-Men animated series. To this day, they're still my favorite X-Men suits. The 90s was also the time that we were introduced to the mutant Black Ops team X-Force, who initially started out as kinda like time-traveling assassins made up of the former New Mutants team, who are now being led by big, gun-toting, time-traveling son of Madeline Pryor, Scott Summers, and sort of Jean Grey from the future, Cable. X-Factor would also continue as a government-funded team led by Havoc and Polaris, and despite the fact that the two mainstay teams were introduced to help simplify the murkiness created by having simply too many characters, the 90s is actually where it gets somehow even more confusing. Despite each team being somewhat tied to a specific X-Men title, these titles both had X-Men in the name, and often stories unfolded and were woven through multiple series, meaning you needed to collect multiple titles to get the whole story. While this can be fun at the time of collecting, it can also be exhausting, and expensive, and confusing to figure out when you're returning back to older stories. Both teams actually lived in the X-Mansion, but simply went on separate missions. Starting in 1993 with Uncanny X-Men issue 298 and X-Men issue number 17, the teams also started to swap members for certain missions, making everything even more confusing for readers to try to discern between the two once very distinct rosters. During this era, however, we did get many memorable and character-defining stories, including Fatal Attractions, Phalanx Covenant, and the Onslaught event. But by 1994, the terms blue and gold had kinda lost all meaning, with both teams pretty much melding together. By 1998, the roster had shrunk down to 8 core members, including Wolverine, Storm, Nightcrawler, Colossus, Kitty Pryde, Rogue, Gambit, and Marrow, surprisingly, with stories featuring the team continuing to weave back and forth between Uncanny X-Men and the X-Men series, starting with issue number 360 and issue number 80, respectively. Since the 90s, there have been a slew of other important stories as we moved into the 2000s and beyond, including the alternate timeline Ultimate X-Men, E is for Extinction, House of M and M-Day, Messiah Complex and Messiah War, Schism, Avengers vs. X-Men, Inhumans vs. X-Men, and Resurrection. There have also been countless X-Men books featuring multiple teams, many of which simply refer to themselves as the X-Men, even when a mainstay X-Men book was also already ongoing alongside them, which means we get a lot of stories, but also making sense of the X-Men roster gets more and more confusing. These titles have included The Amazing X-Men, The Astonishing X-Men, Extreme X-Men, New X-Men, which was the mainstay at the time known as the Grant Morrison era of X-Men, X-Men Legacy, Young X-Men, Wolverine in the X-Men, which is actually one of my favorites, All New X-Men, which featured the time-displaced OG X-Men, X-Men Gold, Spider-Man in the X-Men, Extraordinary X-Men, the 2017 relaunch of Blue and Gold teams with X-Men Blue and X-Men Gold. And then of course there were all the books that were simply known as Uncanny X-Men and X-Men, including one volume of the series simply titled X-Men from 2015 that features an all-female roster of mutants led by Storm that I feel like no one really ever talks about for some reason. I still can't believe how seemingly quiet the hype surrounding that series was, and I know that not a lot of people were super here for it, but also, what a cool team! I suppose it all pretty much goes to show you that by the 2010s, people were pretty much overwhelmed with X-Men content, with the mutant hype receding for some time. To give you some more perspective here, despite the initial X-Men series being consistently returned to, sometimes renamed, but often maintaining or returning to actual legacy numbering, we are still also on the 6th volume of the X-Men title with the 2021 series. Pretty crazy to think, considering how long some of those other series went on for. The modern age, however, has seen a great boost to X-Men popularity, and I have to say I feel lucky to be one of the folks reading along through this entire era. In 2019, Jonathan Hickman and Pepe Larraz became the main creative team behind House of X and Powers of 10, which kicked off the era of X-Men we are in now, which I like to refer to as the Krakoan era. This has been a 3-part multi-year saga that is still ongoing, spanning a number of series in the double digits. The 3 major acts of this epic can be divided between Dawn of X, Reign of X, and Fall of X. Events have included one of my all-time favorites, Ten of Swords, the Marvel-wide crossover AXE Judgment Day or Axe, and SOS, aka Sins of Sinister, as well as recurring yearly Hellfire galas, which we can all dress up and attend in our minds. However, the X-Men history and family will continue on as the Krakoa era is soon coming to a close, with 2023's Hellfire Gala being advertised as the last. My heart.